I'm Sage Trent, 22, a proud soldier who's worked hard for everything I have. For years, I trusted my parents to be honest stewards of the support my grandfather provided while I served. But on my birthday, when my millionaire veteran grandpa asked if my military housing was comfortable, and I had to reply, "What housing? I live in the barracks," everything changed. Have you ever been blindsided by the people you thought you could trust most? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to draw the line after being betrayed, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What came next? Even I didn't see coming. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs through years of conversations that never quite added up. My parents had this way of talking around money, especially when it came to Grandpa's generosity. They'd mention his help with a kind of ownership that made me uncomfortable, as if his kindness toward me somehow belonged to them. "Your grandfather is so good to us," Mom would say, and I'd wonder why she said us when he was writing checks with my name on them. Dad had this habit of bringing up my military service in strange contexts, usually when bills came up or when they were discussing household expenses. "Well, our daughter's taken care of," he'd say, and I'd feel that familiar twist in my stomach because I wasn't taken care of. I was living paycheck to paycheck like every other junior enlisted soldier, stretching dollars and eating ramen more nights than I cared to count. The allowance comments were the worst. Friends of my parents would congratulate me on how comfortable I must be, how nice it was to have family support while serving. I'd smile and nod, but inside I was calculating grocery budgets and wondering if I could afford to visit home for Christmas. When I'd mention financial stress to my parents, they'd get this look, not quite annoyed, but close, as if I was being dramatic about something that shouldn't be a problem. "Grandpa's always been generous," Mom would remind me, her tone carrying a weight I didn't understand. "You should be grateful for what you have." But what did I have? The barracks room I shared with another soldier? The uniforms I'd bought with my own money? The car payment that ate up a quarter of my salary? I was grateful for Grandpa's love and support, but I was starting to wonder what exactly I was supposed to be grateful for. The whispers were getting louder too. Extended family members would make comments about my housing situation and how nice it must be to have that security while building my military career. Cousins would joke about my allowance and ask if I was saving money by living rent-free. Each comment was like a puzzle piece I couldn't place, creating a picture that didn't match my reality. I started paying closer attention to phone calls between my parents and Grandpa. They'd speak in this careful code, discussing arrangements and provisions with the kind of vague language people use when they don't want to be pinned down to specifics. When I'd ask direct questions about these conversations, they'd deflect with platitudes about family taking care of family. "Grandpa worries about you," Dad would say. "He wants to make sure you're comfortable while you're serving." But comfortable was the last thing I felt. I was proud of my service, proud of the uniform I wore, but I was also tired and financially stressed in ways that didn't match the narrative my parents seemed to be selling. The unease crystallized one evening when I called home after a particularly brutal training exercise. I was exhausted, my uniform was still damp with sweat, and I'd been looking forward to hearing familiar voices. Instead, I caught the tail end of a conversation between my parents about her monthly amount and whether it was enough to cover everything. When they realized I was on the line, the conversation stopped abruptly. "Cover what?" I asked, but the moment had passed. They brushed off my question with talk about household expenses and how proud they were of my dedication to service. That night, lying in my narrow bunk, I stared at the ceiling and tried to piece together what I'd been missing. The pattern was becoming clear, even if I didn't want to see it. Every financial conversation in my family seemed to include me as a variable I didn't recognize. My parents spoke about my military service as if it came with benefits I'd never received, support I'd never seen. They referenced conversations with Grandpa about my well-being that painted a picture of comfort and security that existed nowhere in my actual life. I began to dread family gatherings because of the comments. Aunts and uncles would pat my shoulder and tell me how lucky I was to have such a supportive family. They'd reference my situation with knowing looks, as if I was living some kind of cushioned military life that bore no resemblance to my reality. When I'd try to correct the narrative, explaining that military life was challenging financially, they'd give me confused looks and change the subject. The worst part was feeling like I was being ungrateful for questioning something I didn't understand. Grandpa had always been generous with his time and attention. He'd supported me through difficult periods, celebrated my achievements, and showed up when it mattered. But there was this growing sense that somewhere in our family dynamic, wires were getting crossed in ways that left me feeling both supported and somehow exploited. My parents' defensiveness was growing too. When I'd bring up financial struggles, they'd remind me of everything Grandpa does for you, as if that should settle the matter. When I'd ask for specifics about what exactly he was doing, they'd get irritated and accuse me of being difficult. The conversations always ended with them painting me as ungrateful for questioning good fortune I couldn't actually locate in my life. I started documenting my own expenses, partly to understand my budget better and partly because I was beginning to suspect that someone, somewhere, had a very different understanding of my financial reality than I did. The numbers didn't lie. I was living like every other soldier at my pay grade, scraping by and making choices between wants and needs that didn't match the narrative of comfort and support that seemed to surround me in family conversations. The birthday invitation came with its usual warmth. Grandpa wanted to see me in uniform, wanted to celebrate another year of my service. I was looking forward to it, but I was also dreading it. Something was building toward a confrontation I couldn't name, a reckoning that felt both necessary and terrifying. I pressed my dress uniform that morning with extra care, not knowing I was preparing for the moment that would change everything between us. Standing in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting my ribbons and checking my appearance, I felt the weight of all those accumulated inconsistencies. Today, somehow, I knew the truth would finally surface. I just didn't know how much it was going to hurt. The living room felt smaller than usual when I walked in wearing my dress blues. My parents were arranged carefully on the couch, smiles bright and welcoming, but something felt staged about the scene. Grandpa stood near the window, his own military bearing still evident despite his age, and when he turned to greet me, his face lit up with genuine pride. "There's my soldier," he said, and the warmth in his voice was real. This was the man who had shaped so much of who I'd become, who had taught me about honor and service through his own example. Looking at him, I felt the familiar mix of love and respect that had defined our relationship since childhood. The conversation started normally. We talked about my unit, about training, about the challenges and rewards of military life. Grandpa listened with the attention of someone who understood the weight of service, who remembered what it felt like to wear the uniform. My parents nodded along, contributing comments that felt supportive but somehow off-target, as if they were participating in a conversation they didn't quite understand. Then came the question that would split everything open. "Is your military housing comfortable?" Grandpa asked, his tone casual and caring. He was genuinely interested in my well-being, wanting to know that the granddaughter he loved was being taken care of. The question was simple, straightforward, the kind of thing a caring grandfather would ask. But I didn't have military housing. The words stuck in my throat for a moment. I looked at his expectant face, then at my parents, who had gone very still on the couch. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, and I realized that my answer was going to reveal something none of us were prepared for. "What housing?" I said finally, my voice sounding strange in the quiet room. "I live in the barracks." The change was immediate. My parents' faces went pale, their carefully constructed smiles faltering. Grandpa's expression shifted from casual interest to sharp attention, and I watched understanding begin to dawn in his eyes. The room felt like it was holding its breath. "The barracks?" Grandpa repeated, his voice taking on a different quality. This wasn't confusion. This was the tone of someone who was beginning to see a picture they didn't like. I nodded, suddenly feeling very young despite my uniform and my rank. "Yes, sir. I share a room with another soldier. I've been in the barracks since I got to my first duty station." The words felt important, like testimony I was giving under oath. My parents were looking everywhere except at me. Mom was studying her hands, and Dad was staring at a spot on the wall with intense concentration. The silence was becoming dangerous, charged with implications that were racing through Grandpa's mind faster than I could track them. "Then who?" Grandpa said slowly, his voice carrying the kind of authority I remembered from childhood. "Took the money." The question landed like a physical blow. I felt my knees go weak, and suddenly I understood why my parents looked like they wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. There had been money. Money meant for me, money that was supposed to be providing the housing and comfort that everyone seemed to think I had. "What money?" I asked, but even as the words left my mouth, I was starting to understand. All those comments about my allowance, all the references to my comfortable situation, all the assumptions about my financial security, they were based on something real. Something that had never reached me. Grandpa was staring at my parents now, and his expression was hardening in a way I'd never seen before. This wasn't anger. This was something colder and more final. "The money I've been sending every month for her housing allowance," he said, his voice level, but carrying a threat that made the air in the room feel thin. My parents started talking at the same time, their voices overlapping in a panic of explanations and justifications. They were saying something about expenses and contributions and how they'd been managing things, but their words were washing over me like noise because I was finally understanding the scope of what had been happening. For years, Grandpa had been sending money that was meant to ensure I had a comfortable living situation while I served. Money that was supposed to supplement my military pay, to give me the kind of security and stability that would let me focus on my duties without financial stress. Money that had never reached me. "I never received $1, I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. The words cut through my parents' desperate explanations like a blade, and suddenly the room was quiet again. Grandpa nodded once, a sharp movement that somehow conveyed both understanding and judgment. "I know you didn't," he said, and I realized he'd been testing something, confirming a suspicion he'd been developing. The question is where it went. My parents were pale now, their earlier warmth replaced by something that looked like fear. They were trapped between the granddaughter they'd been lying to and the father-in-law they'd been stealing from, and there was no version of this conversation that was going to end well for them. I stood there in my dress uniform, feeling like I was witnessing the collapse of everything I'd understood about my family. The pride I'd felt walking into this room was curdling into something else, betrayal, humiliation, and a growing anger that felt dangerous in its intensity. The birthday celebration was over before it had really begun, but something much more important was just getting started. Understanding Grandpa meant understanding the military. He'd served in Vietnam, come home to a country that didn't particularly want to thank him, and built his fortune through the same discipline and attention to detail that had kept him alive in combat. He didn't throw money around carelessly, and he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. When he said he was going to take care of something, it got taken care of. Growing up, I'd spent summers at his house learning lessons my parents never thought to teach. He showed me how to balance a checkbook, how to read a contract, how to shake hands like I meant it. While my parents were focused on the day-to-day chaos of raising kids, Grandpa was teaching me about character and responsibility and the weight that came with carrying the family name. "Your word is your bond," he'd tell me while we worked in his garage, fixing some engine or building some piece of furniture that would outlast us both. "Once you give it, everything else is just details." He lived by principles that seemed old-fashioned to my friends, but made perfect sense to me. Honor wasn't just a concept to him, it was an operating system. When I decided to enlist, he was the one who drove me to the recruiter's office. Not because my parents couldn't, but because he understood what I was choosing in a way they didn't. He'd sat in that same kind of office decades earlier, making the same commitment to serve something larger than himself. He knew what the uniform meant, what I was signing up for, and what it would cost me. Military service isn't a job, he'd told me on the drive home after I'd sworn in. It's a calling. And callings don't come with guarantees except the guarantee that you'll be tested. He was proud of my choice, but he also wanted to make sure I understood what I was walking into. Our relationship deepened after I enlisted. He'd call regularly, not to check up on me like my parents did, but to have real conversations about leadership and responsibility and what it meant to serve. He understood the challenges I was facing because he'd faced them himself. He knew about the financial stress, the physical demands, the emotional weight of being responsible for other people's lives and safety. That's why his support mattered so much. It wasn't just financial, though apparently there was a financial component I'd never seen. It was the knowledge that someone who understood my world was backing my choices and believing in my ability to succeed. When things got tough, and they got tough regularly, I could draw strength from knowing that Grandpa was proud of me. He'd never been particularly warm with my parents. Respectful, but not warm. I'd always attributed that to generational differences, to the natural distance that sometimes exists between strong personalities. But looking back now, I wondered if he'd seen things in them that I'd been too close to notice. His questions about my well-being had always been specific, detailed, the kind of questions someone asks when they want to verify information they've received elsewhere. The military connection between us ran deeper than shared experience. We both understood sacrifice, both understood the difference between complaining and reporting, both understood that some things were worth enduring for the sake of something larger. When I called him after difficult days, he didn't offer empty sympathy. He'd listen to what I was telling him, ask clarifying questions, and then help me think through solutions. "You're not the first person to face this challenge," he'd remind me when I was struggling with leadership issues or training setbacks. "And you won't be the last. The question is what you're going to learn from it that will make you better at helping the person who comes after you." He had this way of putting current difficulties into larger context without minimizing their immediate impact. His house was filled with reminders of his service, but not in the way some veterans displayed their military experience. No walls covered with certificates and photographs, no shrine to past glory. Instead, there were small indicators everywhere of habits formed by military discipline. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose, everything was maintained to a standard that spoke of attention to detail and respect for equipment. He'd taught me to iron my uniforms with the same care he brought to everything else. "Your appearance is a reflection of your respect for the institution you serve," he'd said, showing me how to get creases sharp enough to cut paper. "People judge your competence based on how you present yourself, so make sure you're representing well." It wasn't vanity, it was professionalism. When I'd visit him in uniform, he'd inspect me with the same attention to detail he'd once brought to his own appearance. Not critically, but with the eye of someone who understood that details mattered, that standards existed for reasons that went beyond mere appearance. He was proud when I met those standards, and I was proud to meet them for him. That's what made the betrayal so devastating. The bond between us was built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what service meant. He'd supported my military career not just emotionally, but apparently financially, ensuring that I had resources that would let me focus on my duties without financial distraction. The fact that this support had been intercepted, that my parents had been stealing from both of us while allowing me to struggle, wasn't just theft. It was a violation of everything he'd taught me about honor and responsibility. Standing in that living room, watching the truth dawn on his face, I saw something break in his expression that I'd never seen before. Not anger, but disappointment so profound it looked like grief. Someone had betrayed his trust, stolen his generosity, and used his love for me as a weapon against both of us. The silence after his question stretched like a wire about to snap. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, could hear Mom's shallow breathing, could hear the traffic outside the window. Everything normal and mundane, while the foundation of my family cracked open in the space between us. My parents started talking at once, their voices overlapping in a desperate chorus of justification. Something about household expenses and contributions, and how they'd been managing the money responsibly. Their words tumbled over each other, each excuse contradicting the last, and I watched Grandpa's expression grow colder with every syllable. "Stop," he said quietly, and the authority in his voice cut through their babbling like a knife. They fell silent immediately, shrinking back into the couch cushions. This was the voice of a man who'd commanded troops in combat, who'd built a business empire through sheer force of will. This was not a man who could be manipulated by panic and half-truths. I was still processing what I'd learned, my mind racing through years of conversations and interactions that suddenly made terrible sense. Every time my parents had seemed mysteriously confident about my financial situation, every time they'd brushed off my concerns about money, every time they'd spoken about Grandpa's generosity as if it somehow belonged to them. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. "How much?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "How much has been sent?" Grandpa looked at me with something that might have been pity. $1,500 a month for the past 3 years, he said. Enough to ensure you had comfortable off-base housing and could focus on your service without financial stress. The numbers hit me like physical blows. $45,000. $45,000 that should have changed my entire military experience, that should have given me the security and stability that everyone seemed to think I already had. "We can explain," Dad started, but I held up my hand to stop him. For the first time in my life, I didn't want to hear their explanations. I was tired of their stories, tired of their justifications, tired of being the one who had to make sense of their choices. "I lived in the barracks," I said, looking directly at them. "I ate ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I want to count. I worked extra shifts to make ends meet. I skipped leave because I couldn't afford to travel home, while you were spending money that was meant for me." My voice was steady, but I could feel something dangerous building behind my ribcage. Mom was crying now, her makeup running in dark streams down her cheeks. "You don't understand the pressure we were under," she said. "The expenses, the house payments, everything we've sacrificed for this family." But her words sounded hollow, self-serving in a way that made my stomach turn. "What you've sacrificed?" I repeated, and I could hear Grandpa's influence in my voice, that same quiet authority that brooked no argument. "I'm the one who's been sacrificing. I'm the one who's been serving. I'm the one who's been living without the support that was supposed to be there." Grandpa was watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone gathering evidence. I realized that this moment, as devastating as it was for me, was probably not entirely surprising to him. He'd been asking careful questions for months, maybe years, trying to understand why his generosity wasn't producing the results he'd expected to see. "The money stops today," he said, and his voice carried the finality of a judge passing sentence. "All of it. Every arrangement, every automatic transfer, every account that has your names on it." My parents went white, and I realized for the first time how much of their lifestyle had been built on his support. "Dad, please," Mom whispered, but he was already shaking his head. "You stole from a soldier," he said, and each word was measured and deliberate. "You stole from my granddaughter while she was serving her country. You took money that was meant to honor her sacrifice and used it for your own comfort. There's no excuse for that. There's no justification that makes it right." I felt something shift inside me, some fundamental change in how I understood my place in this family. For years, I'd been the one trying to bridge gaps, trying to smooth over conflicts, trying to make everyone happy. But I was done being the one who absorbed everyone else's dysfunction while my own needs went unmet. "I need to go," I said, and I meant it. I couldn't stay in this room, couldn't continue this conversation, couldn't pretend that we were going to work through this like a normal family disagreement. Something had broken that couldn't be fixed with apologies and promises to do better. My parents started protesting immediately, begging me to stay, to talk it through, to give them a chance to explain properly. But I was already moving toward the door, already putting distance between myself and the wreckage of everything I'd believed about them. Grandpa followed me outside, his footsteps steady behind me as I walked to my car. The evening air was cold against my face, sharp and clean after the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. "I'm sorry," he said, and the weight in those 2 words told me he understood exactly what this cost. "I should have verified that you were receiving what I was sending. I should have asked more direct questions sooner." I turned to look at him, this man who had shaped so much of who I'd become, and saw my own sense of betrayal reflected in his eyes. We'd both been victims of the same deception, both manipulated by people we'd trusted to act with basic decency. "It's not your fault," I said, and I meant it. "You were trying to take care of me. They were the ones who decided to steal it." The words felt important, like a line I was drawing that would define how I thought about this going forward. We stood there in the driveway, 2 soldiers who'd been betrayed by the people who were supposed to have our backs. But we still had each other, still had the bond that had been built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. That, at least, felt solid in a world that had suddenly become very uncertain. The calls started the next morning while I was getting ready for PT. My phone buzzed insistently on the dresser, displaying Mom's name over and over again. I let it go to voicemail, laced up my running shoes, and headed out for formation. Whatever she needed to say could wait until I'd had time to process what had happened. But the calls didn't stop. Throughout the day, between training exercises and briefings, my phone would light up with missed calls and text messages. Mom, Dad, sometimes both of them in rapid succession. The messages started apologetic, then became pleading, and by evening they'd taken on a tone that was becoming familiar. Somehow this was all my fault for being unreasonable. "You're tearing this family apart," one text read. "All we've ever done is try to support you, and this is how you repay us?" I stared at the screen, amazed by their ability to flip the narrative, to make themselves the victims of a situation they'd created through years of deliberate deception. My roommate, Chin, noticed my mood during evening chow. "Family drama?" she asked, not prying but letting me know she was available to listen if I needed to talk. Chin was good that way, present but not pushy, supportive without being overwhelming. "Something like that," I said, pushing food around on my plate without much appetite. "Found out my parents have been stealing money my grandfather was sending for my housing." Saying it out loud made it sound even more surreal, like something that happened to other people in soap operas or cautionary tales. Chin winced. "That's rough. How much are we talking about?" $1,500 a month for 3 years, I said, and watched her eyes widen. In our world, that was serious money. That was the difference between scraping by and living comfortably, between stress and security. I had no idea it existed until yesterday. "Jesus," Chin said quietly. "What are you going to do?" That was the question I'd been avoiding all day. What was I going to do? I couldn't undo 3 years of theft, couldn't reclaim the money or the security or the peace of mind I should have had. But I could decide how to move forward, how to handle the relationships that had been built on lies. The pressure from my parents was relentless. They seemed to think that if they could just wear me down, get me to answer the phone, force me into a conversation, they could somehow spin this back to a misunderstanding that could be forgiven and forgotten. But I wasn't interested in their explanations anymore. I was tired of being the one who had to make their choices make sense. Extended family members started reaching out too, clearly having been fed some version of events that cast me as the unreasonable party. Cousins who'd never shown much interest in my military service suddenly became concerned about family unity and the importance of forgiveness. Aunts and uncles sent carefully worded messages about how family was forever and how pride could be destructive. But none of them mentioned the theft. None of them acknowledged that $45,000 had been stolen from me while I was serving my country. They were all focused on healing relationships and moving forward, as if the underlying betrayal was just a minor disagreement that could be smoothed over with enough pressure and time. Grandpa called midweek, his voice steady but tired. "How are you holding up?" he asked, and I could hear genuine concern beneath the question. "I'm angry," I said honestly. "And I'm tired of people acting like I'm the problem for being angry about being stolen from." It felt good to say it plainly, to name what was happening without softening it or making excuses for anyone. "Good," he said, surprising me. "You should be angry. What they did was wrong, and pretending otherwise won't make it right." There was something comforting about his straightforward approach, his refusal to minimize what had happened for the sake of family peace. He told me he was working with his attorney to understand the full scope of what had been happening, tracing money flows and identifying accounts that might need to be closed or reorganized. It was a business approach to a personal problem, but it felt appropriate. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family dynamics. This was about theft and breach of trust on a scale that required serious consequences. "I've cut off their access to everything," he said. "Completely. They won't be getting another dollar from me, and I'm restructuring my estate planning to ensure they can't manipulate any future arrangements." His voice carried the finality of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. That weekend, I drove to Grandpa's house, still in uniform after a long day of training. He met me at the door with the same pride he'd always shown when I visited in dress blues, but there was something different in his expression now, a sadness that hadn't been there before. We sat in his study, surrounded by the books and mementos of a life well lived, and talked about what came next. Not about forgiveness or reconciliation, but about practical matters. How to rebuild trust that had been shattered, how to move forward without the people who'd betrayed us both. "I failed you," he said at one point, and the pain in his voice was evident. "I should have verified that my help was reaching you directly. I should have been more suspicious when things didn't add up." "You trusted them to do the right thing," I said. "That's not a failure. That's what decent people do. They trust family to act with basic integrity." But even as I said it, I realized that both of us would probably be more careful about trust going forward. Some lessons could only be learned through betrayal. We made plans that evening. Real plans, built on direct communication and clear expectations. If he wanted to help me financially, it would be through accounts that only I controlled. If he had concerns about my well-being, he'd ask me directly rather than relying on reports from people who'd proven themselves untrustworthy. For the first time since my birthday revelation, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The future was uncertain, but at least it would be built on honesty rather than lies. The shift in our relationship was immediate and profound. Where there had once been the comfortable distance of grandfather and granddaughter, there was now something closer to partnership. We'd both been betrayed by the same people, both manipulated in service of the same lies, and that shared experience created a bond that ran deeper than blood relationship alone. Grandpa started calling more frequently, not to check up on me but to include me in conversations about business and planning that he'd never shared before. He'd ask my opinion on investments, discuss market trends, seek my perspective on decisions that had nothing to do with my parents or the money they'd stolen. I realized he was treating me as an adult in ways he never had before, seeing me as someone whose judgment could be trusted. "You have good instincts," he told me after I'd offered some thoughts on a potential acquisition his company was considering. "Clear thinking, practical approach. That's worth more than most people realize." Coming from him, the praise felt substantial, earned rather than given out of family obligation. He also started sharing stories I'd never heard before, tales from his military service and early business years that revealed struggles and setbacks he'd never mentioned. Not war stories meant to entertain, but real accounts of times when he'd had to make difficult decisions, times when he'd been let down by people he'd trusted, times when he'd had to rebuild after betrayal or failure. "The hardest lesson," he said one evening as we walked around his property, "is learning that people can love you and still use you. Your parents aren't evil, but they're weak. And weak people will sacrifice others to avoid consequences for themselves." It was a harsh assessment, but it rang true in ways I wasn't comfortable admitting. Meanwhile, the pressure from my parents was intensifying rather than diminishing. They'd moved beyond phone calls and texts to more dramatic gestures, flowers sent to my barracks, cards delivered through mutual friends, even a visit to my base that security had to turn away because they weren't on my approved visitor list. Each gesture felt like another violation, another refusal to accept that their actions had consequences. The flowers came with a card that read, "We love you and miss you. Family is forever." I threw them in the trash without reading the message twice, but Chin rescued the card and showed it to me later. "That's manipulative as hell," she said, studying the carefully chosen words. "They're trying to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself from people who stole from you." Chin had become my reality check, the person who could see the situation clearly because she wasn't tangled up in family dynamics and wishful thinking. Other people in my unit started noticing the stress. My squad leader pulled me aside after a particularly difficult training exercise where I'd been more aggressive than necessary, more willing to push through pain than was tactically sound. "Everything okay at home?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Leaders in the military learned to recognize when personal issues were affecting performance, and they learned to address them before they became bigger problems. "Family drama," I said, using the same phrase I'd used with Chan, but knowing it didn't capture the scope of what was happening. People I trusted turned out to be untrustworthy. It was the most I was willing to share, but it was enough for her to understand that I was dealing with something significant. "You need time off to handle it," she offered, but I shook my head. Work was the one place where things made sense, where expectations were clear and performance was measured honestly. The last thing I wanted was time off to sit with my thoughts and deal with family members who refused to accept responsibility for their choices. Grandpa and I developed our own rhythm of communication, separate from the chaos my parents were trying to create. We talk every few days, sometimes about practical matters and sometimes about larger questions of values and priorities. He was teaching me things about business and investment that my parents had never thought to share, treating me as someone who might someday need to understand complex financial arrangements. Money is a tool, he said during one of these conversations. It can be used to build or destroy, to support or control. The key is understanding the difference between help that empowers and help that creates dependence. I thought about the money my parents had stolen, about how it was supposed to have empowered me to focus on my service without financial distraction, and how instead it had been used to maintain their lifestyle while I struggled. He also started including me in family business discussions that had previously been limited to my parents and their generation. I learned about trusts and estate planning, about the difference between gifts and loans, about the importance of clear documentation when money changed hands between family members. It was practical education, but it was also a message about my role in the family going forward. Your parents won't be managing any family business interests, he said matter-of-factly during one of these conversations. That responsibility will fall to you eventually, so you need to understand how things work. It wasn't a punishment exactly, but it was a natural consequence of their breach of trust. They'd proven they couldn't be relied upon to handle money responsibly, so those responsibilities would go elsewhere. The most significant change was in how I thought about family loyalty. I'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made excuses for other people's behavior. But this betrayal was too big to smooth over, too fundamental to excuse. For the first time in my life, I was prioritizing my own well-being over family harmony, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. Chin noticed the change too. You seem more settled, she observed one evening as we were cleaning our gear after a long day in the field. Like you've made a decision about something important. She was right. I had made a decision, or maybe several decisions. I decided that trust had to be earned rather than assumed. I decided that family relationships, like any other relationships, had to be based on mutual respect and honesty. And I decided that I was done apologizing for other people's choices. 3 months after the revelation, I was settling into a new normal that felt both strange and surprisingly comfortable. The constant pressure from my parents had finally begun to ease, not because they'd given up, but because I'd stopped engaging with their attempts to rewrite history. Their calls went to voicemail, their texts went unanswered, and their third-party messengers were told politely but firmly that this was between me and them. The silence felt like victory, but it was a complicated kind of victory. I was sleeping better, performing better at work, feeling more focused and clear-headed than I had in years. But I was also grieving the loss of the parents I'd thought I had, the family I'd believed existed. It was possible to be relieved and heartbroken at the same time, to feel stronger and more alone simultaneously. Grandpa understood this complexity in ways that surprised me. Grief isn't just for death, he said during one of our evening walks around his property. Sometimes you have to grieve the living, grieve the relationships you thought you had with people who turn out to be different than you believed. He spoke from experience, I realized, from his own history of disappointments and betrayals that had taught him to value authenticity over comfort. Work became my anchor during this period. The military had always provided structure and purpose, but now it felt like salvation. My duties were clear, my performance was measured objectively, and my relationships with fellow soldiers were based on mutual respect and shared commitment rather than blood ties and assumed obligations. When everything else felt uncertain, I could count on the rhythm of formation and training, the clarity of mission and accountability. My squad leader had been watching my performance carefully since our conversation about family drama, and I could tell she was pleased with what she saw. I was more focused, more willing to take initiative, more confident in my decision-making. The personal crisis that could have derailed my military career was instead sharpening my effectiveness as a soldier. You've grown up this year, she told me during a performance counseling session. Whatever you've been dealing with outside of work, it's made you stronger as a leader. She was right, though the cost of that growth was higher than she probably realized. Chin had become something like family during this period, the kind of chosen family that military people sometimes create when blood family fails them. She was there for the bad days when grief hit unexpectedly, there for the good days when I needed someone to share small victories with. She didn't try to fix anything or offer solutions I hadn't asked for. She just provided steady presence and honest perspective. "Your parents are still sending stuff," she told me one afternoon, holding a package that had been delivered to our unit. Cookies this time, with another guilt trip card attached. I took the package and dropped it directly into the trash without opening it, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier but felt natural now. Grandpa's support was becoming more sophisticated and more direct. Rather than sending money to people who couldn't be trusted to pass it along, he was teaching me about financial management and investment, helping me build my own security rather than depending on anyone else's generosity. It was a different kind of support, one that built capability rather than dependence. "The best gift I can give you," he said as we reviewed investment options for my military savings plan, "is knowledge that no one can steal from you. Money can be taken, but understanding can't be." He was right, and I was beginning to appreciate the difference between help that empowered and help that created vulnerability. He also started including me in larger family financial discussions, conversations about estate planning and business succession that my parents had previously been part of. It wasn't a punishment exactly, but it was a natural consequence of their breach of trust. Responsibilities and privileges that had been theirs were flowing to me instead, changing my role in the family structure permanently. The most surprising development was how much I didn't miss the constant drama and tension that had characterized my relationship with my parents. I'd thought their absence would feel like loss, but mostly it felt like relief. No more walking on eggshells around their financial anxiety, no more trying to decode their cryptic comments about money and obligations, no more feeling guilty for struggling financially while they apparently had resources they never shared. Other family members occasionally tried to broker reconciliation, usually around holidays or significant events when family unity felt more important to them. But their efforts were half-hearted, based more on social expectations than genuine understanding of what had happened. They wanted peace without justice, healing without accountability, and I wasn't interested in that kind of shallow resolution. "Your parents made mistakes," my aunt said during one phone call that started as birthday wishes and turned into family intervention. "But they love you, and love should count for something." The comment revealed how little she understood about what had actually happened. This wasn't about mistakes or hurt feelings. This was about systematic theft and deliberate deception over years. "Love doesn't give people the right to steal from you," I said, keeping my voice level but firm. "And I'm not obligated to accept abuse just because it comes from family." The conversation ended shortly after that, but I felt proud of myself for stating my position clearly rather than backing down to avoid conflict. The holidays that year were different, but not necessarily worse. Instead of the tense family gatherings I'd grown accustomed to, I spent Thanksgiving with Chen's family, who welcomed me warmly and asked no complicated questions about my own relatives. Christmas was quiet, spent at Grandpa's house with just the two of us, talking about books and business and military history without any underlying tension or hidden agendas. "This is better," I told him as we sat by his fireplace on Christmas evening, each of us reading and occasionally sharing interesting passages or thoughts. "Quieter, but better." He nodded without looking up from his book, understanding exactly what I meant. By the new year, I was beginning to understand that the crisis had revealed something important about myself. I was stronger than I'd known, more capable of standing alone than I'd believed, and better at making difficult decisions than I'd given myself credit for. The betrayal that could have broken me had instead shown me what I was made of, and what I found there was solid enough to build on. A year after the birthday that changed everything, Grandpa and I were having dinner at his favorite restaurant, both of us in civilian clothes for once, looking like any grandfather and granddaughter celebrating a milestone. But we both knew this wasn't just another birthday dinner. This was a marker, an anniversary of the day we'd both learned painful truths about people we'd trusted. "How are you feeling about it all?" he asked as we waited for our food, his question encompassing everything that had happened and changed in the past 12 months. It wasn't small talk. He genuinely wanted to know how I was processing the long-term effects of discovering my parents' betrayal. Different, I said, considering the question seriously. Clearer, I think. Like I finally understand some things that never made sense before. It was true. Looking back on my childhood and early military career, patterns were visible now that had been invisible when I was living through them. My parents' anxiety about money, their strange relationship with Grandpa's generosity, their assumptions about my financial situation, it all made sense now. The restaurant was busy, filled with families celebrating various occasions, and I found myself observing other tables with new eyes. Which relationships were built on honesty, and which were built on comfortable lies? Which families were genuinely supportive, and which were performing support while serving their own interests? I developed a kind of X-ray vision for dysfunction that I wasn't sure was entirely healthy, but felt necessary for self-protection. Grandpa followed my gaze around the room. "Hard to trust appearances now, isn't it?" he said, reading my thoughts with the accuracy that had developed between us over the past year. Once you see how easily people can lie to themselves and others, it changes how you look at everything. Our relationship had evolved into something I'd never expected but treasured deeply. We talked about business and investments, about military history and current events, about books and ideas with the ease of intellectual equals rather than grandfather and granddaughter. He'd given me responsibilities in his business affairs that my parents had never been offered, trusting me with information and decisions that reflected his confidence in my judgment. "I've been thinking about the future," he said as our dinner arrived. "About what happens to the family business when I'm gone, about how to structure things so they can't be manipulated or mismanaged." It was a conversation we'd been building toward for months, but tonight felt like the right time to make it explicit. I knew he was referring to my parents, to the question of whether they would ever be trusted with family financial responsibilities again. The answer was becoming increasingly clear: they wouldn't. Their choices had consequences that extended far beyond our personal relationship, consequences that affected their role in the larger family structure permanently. "I want you to understand how serious I am about this," he continued. "What they did wasn't just theft. It was a betrayal of trust that affects everything: my trust in them, their credibility with the rest of the family, their ability to be involved in any financial decision-making going forward." His voice was matter-of-fact, but I could hear the sadness underneath. He'd lost his son and daughter-in-law as surely as I'd lost my parents. The practical implications were significant. Trust documents were being rewritten, business succession plans were being restructured, and financial arrangements that had been in place for decades were being dismantled and rebuilt around different assumptions about who could be relied upon to act with integrity. "I'm not doing this to punish them," he said, anticipating my thoughts. "I'm doing it to protect what we've built and to ensure it goes to people who will handle it responsibly." They had their chance to prove they could be trusted with significant resources. They chose to abuse that trust. I thought about my parents during this conversation, wondered how they were processing their changed circumstances. The financial support they'd grown accustomed to was gone, the future inheritance they'd probably been counting on was being redirected, and the respect they'd once enjoyed within the family had been permanently damaged. These were the real consequences of their choices, more lasting and significant than any argument we might have had about their deception. "Do you think they understand what they've lost?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. He'd known them longer than I had, understood their psychology in ways that my closeness to the situation might have obscured. "I think they understand they're facing financial consequences," he said thoughtfully. "But I don't think they understand the deeper loss, the loss of trust, the loss of respect, the loss of their role in the family structure. They're still focused on trying to fix the relationship with you rather than accepting responsibility for what they did." His assessment felt accurate and depressing simultaneously. Meanwhile, my own life had stabilized in ways that surprised me. Without the constant undercurrent of financial stress that had characterized my early military career, I was performing at a higher level, taking on additional responsibilities, and being considered for leadership positions that would have been out of reach when I was struggling to make ends meet. The support Grandpa was providing now, direct, transparent, and designed to build my capabilities rather than create dependence, was having the effect he'd originally intended. "You're thriving," he observed, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. This is what I wanted to see when I started sending that money years ago. Someone focused on their service, building their career, not worried about basic financial security. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. His support was finally working as intended, but only after we'd cut out the people who'd been diverting it for their own purposes. My relationship with extended family had also evolved. Some relatives had taken my parents' side, buying into their narrative of being unfairly treated and cut off. But others had watched the situation unfold and drawn their own conclusions about who was telling the truth. Family loyalties were shifting, alliances were being reconsidered, and I was finding myself with supporters I'd never expected and losing connections I'd thought were solid. "Family is more complicated than people want to admit," Grandpa said as we finished our meal. "Blood relationships don't guarantee loyalty, and loyalty doesn't guarantee good judgment. Sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones who'll hurt you worst, because they know you'll forgive them." It was a harsh assessment, but it matched my own experience too closely to argue with. As we left the restaurant, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since that devastating birthday dinner a year earlier. Not closure exactly, because some wounds don't heal completely, but acceptance. I understood now what had happened, why it had happened, and what it meant for my future relationships with everyone involved. The lesson had been expensive, but it was also invaluable. Boundaries weren't betrayal, they were survival. And sometimes, survival required cutting ties with people who couldn't be trusted to act in your best interest, even when those people were family. Walking to our cars in the parking lot, Grandpa turned to me one last time. "I'm proud of how you've handled this," he said. "Not just the crisis, but the aftermath. You didn't let it break you, and you didn't let it make you bitter. You learned from it and got stronger." His words felt like benediction, like official recognition that I'd passed some test I hadn't known I was taking. Looking back now, I can see that birthday revelation as the moment my real adult life began. Not when I enlisted, not when I moved out of my parents' house, but when I finally understood that love without honesty wasn't really love at all, and that the most important loyalty I owed was to my own integrity and well-being. Some lessons can only be learned through betrayal, but once learned, they become the foundation for everything that comes after. That birthday changed everything. I stopped making excuses for my parents, and I learned that even family can cross lines you never thought they would. Have you ever discovered someone close to you is lying about money or using your trust for their own gain? How did you handle it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe in holding people accountable, even when it's family, hit like, subscribe, and share this story.